This is Dr. Hamilton. Welcome to my video series on William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. In this video, I'd like to discuss Benedick and Claudio. So, in order to do a deep dive into these characters, I think it's important that we ask ourselves, where did they come from? At least most immediately. So we know that the majority of the action in the play takes place in a town called Messina, which is on the island of Sicily, off the coast of what is now known as Italy, though it wasn't known as that then, at the time that the play was taking place. These soldiers have arrived in Sicily, and what have they come from? They've come from a successful war, and they bring with them their relationships with each other that had been forged in war. Which characters are those? Don Pedro, Benedick, Claudio, and Don John. We know that Don John has had a falling out with his brother somehow, but generally their relationships have been forged in the war together. And so when we think about a character like Benedick and the way that he views relationships, we have to understand that. When they get to Messina, they're on vacation, and so they're immediately thinking about romance. And as a consequence of this, they are measuring their prospective relationships with women against their relationships with men in the army. The camaraderie, the loyalty, and all of the bonds, all of the rules of being a soldier. And one of the things that is incredibly frustrating for somebody like Benedick is that women like Beatrice don't follow the rules, right? She will hurl a volley of put-downs at him and totally unapologetically destroy his sense of authority, destroy his sense of his importance, his own self-importance. We remember that Beatrice thrusts in between these male relationships and she sends them up. She makes them seem ridiculous. And of course, Benedick, who has in his mind worked very hard to become a well-respected soldier, is totally taken aback by this. They don't follow the rules of the army. They don't follow the rules of loyalty. They don't respect the code of male authority, and so forth. And so Benedick has established this kind of settled misogyny, which is the hatred of women. I would say it's a kind of a casual misogyny. He seems quite playful about it, but it does represent some deep fears that he has. And Benedick's views do have an influence on Claudio. And one of the things I want to discuss in this video is the way that Benedick's views seem to influence Claudio and how he views things. Now, Claudio is a different sort of story. And I think that Claudio actually may take Benedick's views much more seriously than Benedick does himself. And whether or not Benedick's opinions have affected Claudio and he's sort of taken them to heart, or Claudio himself simply harbors insecurities, is not entirely clear. But I think that you can see the play does suggest that Benedick has an influence on Claudio. And of course, Don John has a huge influence on Claudio. So why does everybody influence Claudio? That is an important question to start out with, and it's an important way to enter into Claudio's character. So Claudio is set up by Shakespeare as an inexperienced, kind of innocent character, a subject of influence. Although he's singled out by the messenger at the very, very start of the play for praise, he does in the figure of a lamb, we remember, the feats of a lion. What is impressive is that he has covered himself in glory but he has done it so young. He is compared to a lamb. So the fact that Claudio is young is actually reinforced throughout the play. Benedick, in Act 5, when he challenges Claudio to a duel, calls him Lackbeard. And Antonio, Hero's uncle, as well as Leonato, insults him as Sir Boy. Benedick calls him Lackbeard in Act 5, Scene 1, line 183. And Antonio, Hero's uncle, insults him as Sir Boy at Act 5, Scene 1, line 83. So Claudio's youth and inexperience is something that other characters refer to, and it gives Shakespeare a way, or gives us a way, to possibly rationalize some of his naivete and credulity when he falls for Don John's plots twice. And also his general immaturity and inability to manage his own emotion and inability to take himself seriously, or any subject seriously, really. It also gives us a context for the friendship between Claudio and Benedick, and it's a good way to look at them closely. So let's remember when Beatrice addresses that messenger in Act 1, Scene 1, she specifically asks him, "Is there no young squarer now that will make a voyage with Benedick to the devil?" Act 1, Scene 1, line 78. Beatrice implies here that it's common for Benedick to have proteges, young proteges. And as somebody who has a kind of a doctrine, we might say a doctrine of misogyny, a doctrine of woman-hating, we would expect that Benedick would want to have proteges. He seems to be of a settled opinion about that, and possibly about many other things. And so Beatrice jokes that Benedick is going to exert a bad influence on Claudio. She says, "He will hang upon him like a disease. He's sooner caught than the pestilence, and the taker runs presently mad." So, like a disease, that's interesting. A pestilence is the plague, the Black Death. And so what, of course, is Benedick's pestilence, according to Beatrice? I think it is certainly his hatred of women, his misogyny, and his decision that he wants to be a bachelor and not marry. So Beatrice doesn't, of course, make it entirely clear, but I think that's it. Benedick refers to himself as a professed tyrant to women in Act 1, Scene 1, line 130, so he makes no secret of this. It appears that it is generally known. Benedick's view of women is summarized quite succinctly. He says, "Because I will not do women the wrong to mistrust any, I will do myself the right to trust none." So that's kind of a clever formulation. What he means is that he will not get in a relationship with a woman, a serious relationship. I'm sure he endorses casual relationships, but he won't get into a serious one. In other words, he won't trust them, because to do so will lead to constant worry, mistrust, suspicion, fear, paranoia, right? That they're cheating on him, because he has this belief that women are disloyal. That's, of course, the word that Don John uses to describe Hero, disloyal. Once again, evoking that soldierly language. She's a traitor. So we will find out that this is precisely, as I said, this is precisely Don John's view of women. So Don John is the villain, and he tells us sort of what views we should not hold. But Don John holds this very, very similar view of misogyny, a view that echoes Benedick's. So when Don John is told of an intended marriage, which we will later find out is between Claudio and Hero, he exclaims, "What is he for a fool that betroths himself to unquietness?" Betroth means to marry, and so Don John is here saying exactly as Benedick has said, that fools marry, only fools marry, because marriage leads to perpetual unquietness. The husband is perpetually paranoid because the woman is going to be unfaithful. Women are unfaithful. Women are not like soldiers, not like good, honest soldiers like Don John, who goes around trying to cheat everybody around him, right? So, nonetheless, remember that soldierly relationships are an important context, important way that these male characters make sense of the world. And the fact that women do not follow the rules of soldierly bonds is really, really troublesome to them. So Benedick will trust no woman because he will never trust that women are capable of being faithful, right? So, like I said, I mean, Don John's voicing this suggests two things. One, that this misogyny that Benedick holds is widely held among soldiers. It's sort of a settled view among soldiers. And when Don Pedro himself turns against Hero, I think we can see that. That misogyny is right there under the surface, ready to turn on women. And it also, though, undercuts Benedick because Don John is a play's villain, as I said, and it calls into question whether or not Benedick's doctrine, so to speak, is actually true or actually a force of good in the play. And of course, it's not. So I think that what we'll later discover, and one of the things that I'll discuss here, is that Benedick's misogyny has an unintended toxic effect on Claudio. And, you know, we're never entirely sure whether Claudio picks this up from Benedick or if it's just in the water, so to speak. But Benedick does, I mean, he puts his friendship on the line a little bit with Claudio and makes it clear to Claudio that Claudio is being disloyal by being interested in marrying Hero, and we'll see how that plays out. So when Claudio and Benedick are left alone, it is Benedick whose advice Claudio seeks about Hero. So again, Claudio's looking up to Benedick. So in this exchange, Claudio wants to hear Benedick's opinion about Hero, and of course that is just an invitation for Benedick to ridicule her and make witty remarks about her. But Claudio frames himself in this exchange as what would, at the time of the Elizabethans, be known as a typical lover. So he uses an idealizing vocabulary to describe Hero. He says, "Can the world buy such a jewel? Can the world buy such a jewel?" Such language as this is typical of the poet Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch, 1304 to 1374. It's important to understand that Petrarch's sonnets establish a model for idealized romantic poetry that was hugely influential throughout Europe. And I think that what you have to understand is that Petrarch basically taught young people how to love. He taught them the rules of the game. And one of the rules was that your beloved is supposed to be up in the skies, in the stars, an idealized, unattainable, inaccessible object. So, of course, Claudio is following the rules here. And Benedick responds instantly and very cynically when Claudio makes this comment. He says, once again, "Can the world buy such a jewel?" And Benedick responds, "Yes, and a case to put it into." Case is slang for vagina, and so what Benedick is saying, yes, he's basically saying, yes, you can buy that if you make an assignation with a prostitute, right? So kind of harsh, a harsh note there. Benedick is usually not quite that harsh in terms of his misogyny, but I think that he's also feels an instinctive need to puncture Claudio's idealism there, and also to say, look, you're praising her to the skies. What you really mean is that you desire her, not that you love her. And he's expressing some skepticism about the fact that he actually loves her, and he just hates that. He senses something false about it. Come on, guy, snap out of it, so to speak. So when Claudio later declares that he wants to ask Hero to marry him, Benedick responds, "But I hope you have no intent to turn husband, have you?" Now, this phrase turn is critical. It echoes an earlier use of the word turncoat in Benedick's exchange with Beatrice, in his witty banter with Beatrice. And what it suggests is that by turning husband, Benedick's switching sides. Benedick is changing loyalties. Benedick is becoming a traitor to his friend. He's betraying his friend. He's betraying the soldierly camaraderie, the bond. He's betraying the team. He's going to the opposite team, right? Why? And then he proceeds to call her ugly in various ways. But Benedick is, in a deeper sense, making an appeal to Claudio's allegiance, his loyalty, his camaraderie, their bond as a soldier. And this is actually something fairly serious. They've just been in a war, okay, where the bond of being a soldier and betrayal really means something, okay? It could mean life and death. It can mean execution if you betray your side, right? So obviously this is playful and mocking, but this idea about turning husband is something that will return, and it clearly bothers Benedick. And this is the thing, which is that Benedick he's joking around, but we find that he's actually brooded on this thing and thought about it for more than, for 1.5 acts. And he raises it in his first soliloquy. He says of Claudio was wont to speak plain and to the purpose, like an honest man and a soldier. And now is he turned orthography. His words are a very fantastical banquet, just so many strange dishes. May I be so converted, and see with these eyes? I cannot tell. I think not. So in Benedick's view, Claudio's identity as a soldier, speak plain and to the purpose like an honest man and a soldier, has been completely rendered incoherent by his falling in love. He's totally changed. Now his language has changed. It's become a fantastical banquet. It's like he's serving this rich, luxurious, exotic dishes. And he senses that there's something false about it. And then he asks himself, may I be so converted, so changed? And he's disturbed by it. I cannot tell. I think not. But to return back to that scene with Claudio and Don Pedro, I'm sorry. So yeah, he doesn't think that he will change, but he doesn't know. And there's something that has happened to him by witnessing it happen to Claudio. He thinks it could happen to me, and this is extremely disturbing to him. So if we go back to that scene in Act 1, Scene 1, towards the end, what happens is that Don Pedro arrives. Claudio and Benedick have been lagging back, and Don Pedro asks them what they're talking about, and Benedick and Claudio tell them. Don Pedro then starts taunting Benedick about the fact that he will never fall in love. And Benedick abuses Hero, calls her ugly, and Don Pedro finally claims that, Benedick will eventually fall in love. Don Pedro says, well, as time shall try, in time the savage bull doth bear the yoke. And so what Don Pedro means here is that a bull will accept a harness. He means that Benedick will eventually become domesticated. He'll become civilized, housebroken, if you will, and he will eventually marry. And so Benedick takes that metaphor of the savage bull bearing the yoke, the harness, and he says, the savage bull may, but if ever the sensible Benedick bear it, pluck off the bull's horns and set them in my forehead, and let me be vilely painted, and in such great letters as they write, here is good horse to hire, let them signify under my sign, here you see Benedick, the married man. So Benedick here imagines that married life will make him a cuckold. And a cuckold is a man or woman whose spouse cheats on them, quite simply. But the twist is that the cuckold does not know that they're being cheated on, and so is generally in the Elizabethan stage depicted as having horns, which signify the infidelity of the spouse. Other people can see the horns. This is the key. And the person who's been cuckolded cannot see the horns. So this amounts to a kind of dramatic irony. So the audience, everybody around this person who's been cheated on, has knowledge that that person is being cheated on, and that person has no idea. So you can see how this idea, once it caught on, became really rich material for Elizabethan dramatists. They loved it because there's an inherently comic situation. We get to laugh at the husband who's being cheated on by his crafty wife, and he doesn't know it, and he's going around stage, and you can laugh at his ignorance. He's the dupe. And so everybody sees those horns growing on his head, but he can't see them. So Benedick takes this a step further, and he imagines himself not only humiliated in front of other men, but also made target practice. So he says, well, if I do, hang me in a bottle like a cat and shoot at me. And he that hits me, let him be clapped on the shoulder and called Adam. So apparently cats, either dead or alive, let's hope they were dead, were used as target practice. So in Benedick's vision, he becomes a cat that all of his friends, right, are shooting at. Who else would they shoot at? They'd also shoot at a traitor, wouldn't they? A traitor would be executed by firing squad. And so somehow this image of being a cuckold and being a traitor are fused together in this image. Also an image of metamorphosis. The humiliation is utterly beyond anything. So I think it is interesting that later on, when Benedick finally resolves that he is going to marry, he's still thinking of this image of bullets. This image of bullets. Shall quips and sentences and these paper bullets of the brain awe a man from the career of his humor? No, the world must be peopled. So paper bullets of the brain would be the witty jokes that these people would write about him, right? And exchange with one another. And so when he resolves to marry Beatrice, he resolves that he is not going to be overly sensitive about being the object of ridicule by other men. Who cares, really? So at this stage, though, the earlier stage in the play, for Benedick, that world of male camaraderie, which turns out later on to have some very, very big gaps in it, stands in absolute opposition to the world of marriage. So it is, of course, deliciously ironic when Benedick has to prove his love to Beatrice in Act 4 by defending a slandered woman, a woman who has been accused of exactly what he says all women are already guilty of, right? Of being unfaithful to a man. And not only that, but he has to go against his best friend and his commanding officer in order to defend that woman. And that Beatrice will command him, kill Claudio, and he will obey. So that is really Benedick's worst nightmare, right? He's gone on to the other side of the team. He's gone into the other team. And now he's firing at his own side. How can that be possible? It's something that you almost want to tear your brains out over. I mean, it seems utterly beyond anything, right? It is what he most fears. And his initial response is not for the wide world, right? Not for the wide world, but he does it for Beatrice because something has genuinely happened. He has been so converted. But it's not even just that he has to turn against his friend and his commanding officer. It's the authority of everything that he represents, and also an authority that Beatrice sends up and attacks and doesn't recognize, right? And it turns out that Beatrice's judgment is actually more accurate than that formidable male authority in the play that condemns Hero. It's wrong. The judgment of the play, or of those that cluster of men with all of their authority, their soldierly ranks and their positions and their costumes, all of that turns out to be wrong, and Beatrice actually turns out to be right. So maybe something about the way that he's defined himself in terms of that soldierly camaraderie needs to change. So it is therefore appropriate that when he resolves to challenge Claudio, that he sums this up with the line, "Enough, I am engaged." So the word engage did not mean a formal commitment of marriage until about 1610, but it is possible that that meaning was in the air, so to speak, at the time. This is the moment, though, of Benedick's engagement. This is when he is formally engaged to Beatrice, when he resolves to turn against his best friend and his commanding officer. So he becomes now the traitor, but a traitor with principle and conviction. So whereas the plot tests Benedick's misogyny and reveals that he has a deeper love, it tests Claudio, and Claudio utterly fails the test. And I think it turns out that Claudio, in fact, has a deep misogyny, whereas Benedick's misogyny is actually more shallow. And so when he finally does have a transfiguring moment, it's able to shatter it. And Claudio, on the other hand, is another issue. So in Act 1, Scene 1, when Claudio and Benedick are left alone, let's examine that passage again and look at it a little bit more carefully. And I want you to notice something, that tiny little details here that Shakespeare will give you that will reveal deep patterns in the characters in his characters. So we notice, for example, that when Claudio inquires later in the scene of Don Pedro in Act 1, Scene 1, lines 275 to 6, he says, "Hath Leonato any son, my lord?" Very innocent seeming inquiry. Don Pedro responds, "No child but Hero. She is his only heir." So Don Pedro understands what Claudio is asking there. What Claudio is asking, does he have any son? Hero is his only heir, the only person who's going to inherit his fortune. In other words, Don Pedro understands that what Claudio is saying is, how much is my dowry, is Hero's dowry going to be? How much money are we going to get out of this thing? Is there an older brother who is going to get the majority of the inheritance, and Hero will be left with much less? So this materialism, this interest in jewels, so to speak, he calls Hero his jewel, right? Well, maybe he's more interested in her jewels. Maybe he's more interested in her money than he is interested in her as this ideal, this glorified ideal of love. So you might, if you have a chance, take a look at the Act 1, Scene 1 of King Lear, when the Prince of France proposes to Cordelia. He also, he declares that he will take her without a dowry, whereas the Prince of Burgundy will not take her unless she has her dowry. And Shakespeare makes it very clear in Act 1, Scene 1 of King Lear that the Prince of France is the one who has the true love, the true love that is not tied to material gain. So that is, Burgundy keeps insisting, give but that portion which yourself proposed to King Lear. Act 1, Scene 1, line 250, after Cordelia has been disinherited. So you might want to take a look at that. Act 1, Scene 1, line 250 in King Lear, if you want a comparison. So I think that we see then the groundwork for the weakness in Claudio's character. So when Claudio becomes convinced that the prince has actually asked Hero to marry him rather than courting Hero and getting her hand in marriage for Claudio, Claudio has no reason at that point to think anything less of Hero, because at the dance, Hero certainly has no way, she's completely innocent, she has absolutely no way to betray Claudio. There's been no arrangement between them. So in fact, her father thinks that the prince is going to ask her to marry him because he's gotten misinformation. And so Claudio has no reason to believe less of Hero at that point, if in fact he's right and she has accepted the prince's hand in marriage, because there's been no arrangement. He himself was too afraid to ask Hero for her hand in marriage, so she had the prince do it. And of course, there's no way that Hero could know that he was in love with her. But when he meets Benedick at the dance, and Benedick says, "The prince hath got your Hero," meaning the prince has gotten her hand in marriage. Benedick believes this falsely. Claudio's immediate response is not sadness, it's not disappointment, it's not being heartbroken. He says, "I wish him joy of her. I wish him joy of her." It's just physical animality, this is what you'd say if she was a prostitute or something like that. Benedick's response is, "Why, that's spoken like an honest drover. So they sell bullocks. Bullocks are bulls." So I think that the speed with which Claudio goes from praising Hero to the skies as a jewel to her becoming dehumanized, "I wish him joy of her," like a prostitute. And Benedick, then says, you're treating her as if she was a head of cattle to be sold. And so she can become metamorphosed in their conversation into a head of cattle, is shocking. But it shouldn't be surprising if we're really paying attention. There's something hollow about Claudio. He's already been inquiring about her money. She is his jewel. And so, maybe shocking, but entirely surprising. I'm not sure. Claudio, imagines himself as a sort of romantic hero, but what has happened even at this point, he never leaves, and throughout the play, the safety of other men. He has Don Pedro serves as his intermediary, right, to ask Hero for marriage. And then it's Leonato that he has exchanges with after she's resurrected. He has interactions with her father. He only ever deals with Hero directly at that second marriage. Well, when he denounces her, which he's not really talking to her at the first marriage, but at the second marriage, when he apologizes to her. But it's not really an exchange. He never gets to know her. And so, of course, he is so quick to dehumanize her. And I don't think that Claudio has the capacity to experience the kind of enlarged, transfiguring experience that Benedick has, that Benedick discovers to his deep surprise, that simply shatters all of his preconceived notions and causes him to completely realign all of his relationships and helps to give him a kind of moral clarity. He, in Act 5, Scene 1, lines 265 to 6, declares this to Beatrice: "I do love nothing in the world so well as you." Is not that strange? I do love nothing in the world so well as you. Is not that strange? He himself is shocked at his own feelings. Is not that strange? He recognizes them and he can't believe it. And yet, he has become transfigured in that moment by the love that he's experienced. And experiences a kind of grace. We'll find that the word grace is important in Don John and the Forbidden. I talk about that at some length. Benedick finds a kind of grace, which is a kind of salvation, a kind of divine favor in love. But for Claudio, love is a commodity, and it simply doesn't exist except in that realm of exchange. He just never leaves the boys. He never leaves the team. He just wants to remain there, catcalling and being immature and regarding women either as prostitutes or as virgin saints up in the stars. And he does not seem to want to have a realistic interpersonal exchange with a woman whereby he is vulnerable. So in such a context, so what is called love for Claudio, it will eventually simply be betrayal, theft, we might say. If you've got a jewel, it can be stolen, right? Like a head of cattle. And so there's something even a little bit degraded in his comparison with her to a jewel. Jewels can be traded. Jewels can be stolen. Jewels are objects to be owned. He might feel the privileged owner of a jewel, but you're not going to have a relationship with a jewel. So without that experience of love, I think that Claudio just succumbs to endless fantasies of desire and paranoia about betrayal. So later on, when Claudio will accuse Hero at their wedding of unfaithfulness, he declares with grim triumph, this is when he screams at her, humiliates her in front of her friends and family at the wedding. And then he presumes to declare and denounce her from this kind of high moralizing standpoint. Out on these seeming. He calls her seeming, as if she's a fraud. I will write against it. You seem to me as Dian in her orb, as chaste as is the bud ere it be blown. but you are more intemperate in your blood than Venus, or those pampered animals that rage in savage sensuality. So Venus is a virgin goddess. The pampered animal that rages in savage sensuality is supposed to be Hero, but actually I think it's probably more akin to Claudio, at least in Claudio's fevered imagination. So, although what Claudio intends to do is to compare Hero as she was to this virginal goddess, right? And to say, look, now you're just an animal. What he's doing is an illusion, and it evokes Ovid's Metamorphosis. Ovid was a Roman poet, and the Metamorphosis was kind of an encyclopedia almost of mythology at the time that he wrote it. And one of the myths is a myth of Diana, the virgin goddess, and Actaeon, who is a hunter. Diana is also a hunter goddess. Actaeon spies on Diana, and to punish him, Actaeon is metamorphosed into a deer, and he is hunted down by his own hunting dogs. So, in this comparison, Claudio wants to say that Hero was like Diana, this virginal goddess, and now she's an animal. But he is inadvertently revealing that he himself has become the animal, hunted down by his own blind instincts, by his own animal desire that Don John has tapped into and allowed his paranoid fantasies to run rampant. And those paranoid fantasies have transformed him into an animal, a pampered animal, and an animal ready to tear his own supposed beloved apart. This, tragic metamorphosis of Claudio suggests that there might be tragic potential in Claudio. However, this is a comedy, and Claudio is a jerk. So he has this moment where he's filled with passion, and he immediately forgets about Hero after she's disgraced. And even after he believes that she dies, that she believes that she's died of shame, he simply forgets about her. He could care less about her. Why? It's sort of obvious in a certain way, because he never had any relationship with her to begin with. So the friar who is trying to give Hero a chance, he's trying to restore the relationship between Hero and Claudio, believes, I think, rather too optimistically that when Claudio hears the words that she has died, then he shall mourn. Act 4, Scene 1, line 223 and 230. But this is not what happens at all. In fact, Leonato, when Leonato's, in fact, it is Leonato who assumes some of the tragic stature that Claudio lacks. So Leonato is Hero's father, and it's almost as if the tragic stature transfers on to Leonato and his grief over his daughter, and then first his grief over the fall of his daughter, and then the grief at the horrible slander against his daughter once he realizes that she's been wronged. And Claudio just becomes a vacuum. He becomes an empty suit. So when Leonato, after first siding with Claudio at the wedding, later confronts Claudio and accuses him, he cries to Claudio in a way that you would think would pluck at Claudio's humanity, would touch Claudio's humanity, and it simply doesn't. Thou hast so wronged mine innocent child. Thy slander has gone through and through her heart, and she lies buried with her ancestors. Thou hast killed my child. If thou killest me, boy, thou killest a man. That's Act 5, Scene 1, line 63 68 to 9 and 79 to 80. Claudio is, of course, not provoked to remorse. In fact, when Benedick approaches him later, he wants to joke with Benedick about this incident. He says of Leonato and his brother Antonio, who have both accosted him, "We'd like to have our nose snapped off with two old men without teeth." So the only thing that he got out of that exchange, the guy whose daughter he believes has been killed by him through shame, the shame that he has caused her, he has no feelings for him whatsoever. He simply imagines him and Antonio, Hero's uncle, as two old men without teeth who were going to snap off his nose. One thing that's notable, incidentally, about Claudio's humor is it's not very funny. He's not funny. None of his jokes are funny, and that might be something interesting in and of itself to explore. It's only after Claudio is publicly confronted with Borachio's confession of his slander and his collusion, his conspiracy with Don John, that Claudio begins to feel remorse. And here we have to ask ourselves, is Claudio's response because he actually feels bad about Hero, or is it simply because now he knows that he's going to be disgraced because of his, unimaginably horrible behavior towards Hero, and that will get around the town, and the fact that she's been slandered will get around the town, and that everybody will know about it, and so he simply wants to restore his reputation. It's not entirely clear, but I think that meaning is certainly at play. So Don Pedro tells Claudio, once they hear the news that Hero has actually been slandered, "Runs not this speech like iron through your blood?" And Claudio replies, "I have drunk poison whilst he uttered the confession of it." That's Act 5, Scene 1, lines 235 to 6. So Claudio then apologizes to Leonato. "I know not how to pray your patience, yet I must speak. Choose your revenge yourself. Impose me to what penance your invention can lay upon my sin. Yet sinned I not, but in mistaking." So he says he did not sin, but in making a mistake. Well, I think that I think it's clear based on what we've discussed that he's done much more than mistake, but even his mistaking reveals his character, right? The fact that he would trust Don John over his wife, or the woman that he's about to marry. So Claudio's resolve to marry the woman that he thinks is Leonato's brother's other daughter, almost the copy of my child that's dead, suggests not repentance, I think, but what has been true of Claudio all along. That the truth is that he sees Hero, as he does all other women, as interchangeable. He's never left this male group, this male brotherhood, soldierly camaraderie. He's just never left it and entered into a more complicated set of relationships. And so that, of course, is also what prevents him from seeing Don John's treachery. And we notice, too, that Benedick immediately recognizes Don John's treachery. Don Pedro doesn't, but Benedick does. He says the practice of it lives in John the Bastard. The plot probably originated with John the Bastard, but Claudio seems incapable of seeing that. So his problem is just that he's never seen Hero as a person. He's just seen her as an object of desire to be supplied by other men, first Don Pedro and then her father Leonato. As I said, is he just trying to restore his reputation? It's not really clear to me. And at the same time, I think we also should say that Hero herself may less be motivated by selfless love of Claudio than the attempt to restore her reputation, to stand up in front of the entire community, her friends, her family, and tell them all and show them Claudio groveling and asking for her forgiveness, so that everybody sees that he has been humiliated, that he has recognized that he wronged her in front of the entire community, so that she can actually restore her good name and her reputation. And that, I think, gives us a more pragmatic version of Hero, a more realistic version of Hero than simply the masochist, the person who is just endlessly suffering and endlessly selfless in order to restore this marriage with Claudio. The union, though, between Claudio and Hero, to me, feels coerced. It seems like a hollow formality in contrast with Beatrice and Benedick's love, which I think is clearly earned and tested. So the main plot, the main romantic plot with Hero and Claudio, seems to be the one that is ugly, that shows the ugliest side of love, and it's only patched together at the end with violence, I think. And the subplot actually seems to be the one that contains the real, genuine, and tested love. So thank you guys for joining me on this, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time, and we will speak soon.